Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson, Section 15. Start of Subsection 1. "Come on, old chap," said Neville, rising and blowing out of the pool. "Straight in. It's just gorgeous this morning." "Head first?" questioned Jim, a slim shivering figure on the little wooden pier that jutted out over the bathing pool. "Of course. I think," began Jim. "Don't think. Come on." So Jim came on and found himself neatly fielded as he rose, gasping. It really did require a little courage at his age. He could swim a little, but not very much, and the current was considerable here under the little fall that Neville had designed here a couple of years ago. 100 yards westward of the bridge where the trout had been so nearly caught a fortnight before. Overhead the day was perfect. The risen sun, away to the east, shone straight down across the wide meadows that glittered as with diamonds. Neville had slipped off his shoes as he had come down with Jim 10 minutes ago in his pajamas, for the sheer delight of walking barefooted through the dew-dripping grass. The tall trees above the bathing place were motionless in the morning calm, but rang unceasingly with the song of birds. Blackbirds scudded, scolding, from shrubbery to shrubbery. A thrush, visible against the sky, poured out a torrent of music from the top of a post, in full view of the swimmers, exactly as if he had been engaged to do it. A couple of bullocks, with a kind of rustic stupidity in their long faces, eyed the two splashing figures from over the post and rails that shut off the bathing place from the open park, and swerved suddenly with heads down as Jim screamed with joy and gesticulated. Neville found it presently rather hard work battling up against the stream with Jim on his shoulders. He had had another of his headaches 3 days before, and felt a trifle invalidish still. These headaches made astonishing demands upon his strength. "Look here, old chap," he gasped. "This is a bit too much. The stream's so jolly strong this morning. I'm going to drift down to the shallow end and leave you there a bit." Jim hammered at Cousin Neville's head. "No, go on," he said. "You little brew, wait till I get you down." He swerved into the stream, and with long easy strokes sped downwards. Jim prudently rolled off his shoulders as they neared the tail of the pool and floundered to the bank. Neville assured him he should not escape, and then turned once more and began to beat upstream. The world looked extraordinarily delicious viewed from the surface of the clear-running current. Immediately in front of his eyes the long lines of water came racing down, bubbling crisply from below, bearing a little yellowish foam and blossoms as they came. The fall of the river was small enough, yet it sounded like thunder in his ears. The low green bank on the right, with the bullocks' heads still peering over, was as enchanting as the edge of a new world. The dark, shadowed spaces under the beech trees on the left, as mysterious as caverns, and overhead, between the masses of green, he could see that the clear, haze-veiled sky that promised great heat. It was an exultant triumph that morning, warm and caressing, yet with just that sting of early coolness that was like the bubbles in champagne. How frightfully hot London would be! And for a moment or two he wished with all his heart that Enid could have managed to come down here instead of making him come to her. Then he remembered the lawyers and Mrs. Bessington's social delights and understood that it was impossible. He was going up in time to lunch with them. That was why he was bathing here with Jim before breakfast. He would have to leave a little after 10, as he must just go to his house first, in Elizabeth Street, to see that everything was in train for the little dinner this evening. The cook had already gone up to town with a maid or two. Aunt Anna had insisted upon this. Then, this afternoon, he remembered, they were all three to go to something or other. He rather thought it was pictures, but wasn't sure, and this evening to the theatre. He had got the tickets all right, by the way. He was sorry Aunt Anna wouldn't come with him, but she had been quite explicit. She would be entirely in the way, she said. 4 was a much pleasanter number than 5, and of course Neville must have a male friend now and again to entertain Mrs. Bessington, if nothing else. Algy Lennox would do for once or twice. He couldn't be a bore about his tennis very well in London at that time. Besides, she simply loathed London. She might perhaps run up for a day or two at the end and take Jim to the zoo. But really, not more. If Neville didn't mind. So it had been settled, and although he was sorry she wouldn't come, he felt that there really was something to be said on her side. Ah, how delicious the water was! He turned on his back as he came up to the foot of the little 18-inch fall, just in that mystical part of a current which itself, very nearly motionless, is quick with a strange, thrilling vitality from the plunge of air and water beneath. where the myriad bubbles rise, hissing and hushing, and the surface of the water curves and heaves a little. It is just behind that, by the way, that the trout lie and wait for the food that comes so fresh and enticing down the fall, right down to their level, a foot or two above the bed of the stream. He shifted, slowly, from place to place, his head right back in the water, keeping himself afloat by slow paddling with his hands on either side. A film of water washed over his face once or twice, and he closed his eyes. Then, with a rush against his limbs, the current caught him, and he whirled down smiling, still, with closed eyes, till all motion ceased. His eyelids glowed before his eyes, red and flaming against the bright sky. His physical ecstasy was at its height. Start of subsection 2. When he had had enough, he climbed out, dripping on to the little pier. Jim was making a great to-do down there at the shallow end. He could see his head now and again, very agitated, with yet more agitated heels winnowing the water 4 feet behind. He had meant to duck him, but it was too much trouble. He felt a pleasant, languorous ache all over him, and a cigarette seemed absolutely necessary. He waded through the wet grass to get his pajamas and towel, delighting in the brush of the long stems round his feet, dried himself lightly, slipped on his trousers and jackets, got out his case from the pocket, and then, blowing out aromatic clouds, he went back and sat down on the end of the pier with his bare feet tingling. His head felt a little heavy. He thought he had been in the water too long. "Cousin Neville!" cried a shrill voice. He turned to see, and as he turned, a dimness, rather like a torn veil, drifted between him and the white little figure that, standing knee-deep in the shallows 20 yards away, was splashing furiously with both hands. It must be liver, he told himself. Really, he ought to be ashamed of it at his age. He rubbed his eyes quickly with his disengaged hand, then he looked again. Yes, the dimness had gone. No, it hadn't. It was forming again in shreds and patches. Jim apparently wanted no answer. He had shouted out of sheer exhilaration. The splashing had ceased, and once more Neville could make out, but only just make out, the head passing across the sunlit water. Neville stood up. He must take a turn or two. Perhaps the sunlit water had affected his eyes a little. Perhaps he had caught just a shadow of a chill. As he turned up his trousers, a little tangle of black lines drifted over his hands and won again. This was ridiculous. No, he wouldn't walk about. He would just lie still on the pier with his eyes shut. That would put him right. A loud cackle of physical joy made him open them again, and there was Jim in the long grass, entirely unclothed, rolling and tossing to and fro. "Oh, it does tickle so, Cousin Neville." Then, as he looked at him again, that veil drifted suddenly across, and for an instant he saw nothing, immediately in front. Jim was gone in blankness. He could see the post where the thrush had been singing, away to the left, and the solemn lowered bullocks' heads on the right. There was nothing in between. Again he passed his hand over his eye, rubbing them hard. Then he turned away again. Jim mustn't notice anything. He might tell his mother, and there would be a fuss. "You'd better dress, old chap. You'll catch cold." "Oh," said Jim in a long-drawn ecstasy. "Come on, old man," said Neville again. "I really mean it. And then we'll go on a walk and get warm again." "Will you come and shoot a rabbit?" demanded Jim. We'll go and look for one," evaded Neville. "Make haste." He felt perfectly certain that the thing would pass. It had passed before, all right. It was simply his liver. He had sat on the lawn all day yesterday instead of going for a ride. It was that, and the sun on the water. No, more. While Jim dressed in the white shirt and knickerbockers in which he had come down, Neville sat very still with his back to him, keeping his eyes closed and answering questions now and again. "Will you take me with you as far as the village after breakfast, Cousin Neville?" "We'll see what your mother says," said Neville, with closed eyes. "Don't you ever do any lessons?" "Oh, yes," said Jim indifferently. "Cousin Neville, well? Why are you going to London?" "To see Miss Bessington, Cousin Enid." "Oh, why do you want to see Miss Bessington? I mean, Cousin Enid." "Because I like her very much." "Oh, why?" It had been carefully explained to Jim that Cousin Neville was going to marry Miss Bessington, and that he, Jim, would, in future, have to call her Cousin Enid. But Jim did not appear to realize that this involved any particular affection on anyone's part, even on Neville's. It was as if Cousin Neville was going to engage a new housekeeper, no more than that. He had shown no interest whatever in the event. "Because she's very nice," said Neville carefully. "Oh," said Jim, as if he had encountered a brick wall. "Buck up with your dressing, old man." "I'm ready," said Jim. The moment had come, and Neville opened his eyes. For an instant all seemed well. The clear water ran smoothly and swiftly beneath. The cool dark spaces under the beeches opposite looked as they always did. He saw again a blackbird scurry across from one side to the other. Then the veil formed again, as if 100 spiders were spinning black threads at full speed. Glimpses of light and color showed between the meshes, but no more. Neville shut his eyes again, and his heart sickened within him. He still kept his back turned to the boy. "Jim, old man?" "Yes? Look here, I thought of a game. Let's pretend I'm a blind man." "Oh, do you think that would be funny?" "You wait," said Neville. "You haven't heard it yet, and you're my guide. You mustn't touch me, and I mustn't touch you. But you've got to guide me with your voice and tell me where to go." He was inventing desperately. He was perfectly certain that this thing would pass presently, and meantime Aunt Anna must know nothing. Then he heard the stable clock strike 8. "We've lots of time. Even 10 yards that I go without touching anything except the ground is 1 to you, and every time I touch anything, like a tree, it's 1 to me. I must keep my eyes tight shut all the time." "Oh, do you think that's a good game?" asked a doubtful voice. "We'll try it, anyhow." He felt for the edges of the pier with his hands and carefully got to his feet. Then, a little unsteadily, he walked in the direction of Jim until he felt the grass under his feet. "Now begin," he said. "You must carry the towels." He felt it was not much of a success, but it was all that he could think of. Once when Jim screamed with sudden delight as the blind man fell heavily over a log, he thought it might serve a bit longer. But he simply dared not open his eyes. "Look here, you mustn't make me fall down on purpose," he said. "That's not the game. I shall count that 3 to me." From that moment the game certainly flagged. Jim did not seem to find it funny. His voice grew more and more indifferent. Finally Neville stopped. "Where are we?" he said. "What? Where are we?" snapped the other, a little irritably. "Oh, close to the bridge, Cousin Neville." "Very well, we'll stop the game as soon as I touch the bridge. And then his voice faltered, what in God's name should he do if he couldn't see? And what, again, in God's name was the matter? His little headache had quite gone with the exercise. That was one encouragement. But what on earth should he do? His hands touched the stonework. "There," he said, "you've won. 11 to you, 4 to me." Then he opened his eyes and waited. There was the stonework under his hands, the sunlit water flowing swiftly beneath, the outer edge of the pavilion window just in sight, the gold and green of the park splendid in sunlight. He still waited, and they remained as before. He rolled his eyes round and again looked. It was all right. "Why do you look like that, Cousin Neville? My dear boy, I've only just got my sight back. Now we'll do any mortal thing you like till 8:45. Start of subsection 3. As the clock struck the half-hour, they were sitting on the bench with their backs to the Georgian monument. Jim had decided that, as compensation for their extraordinarily stupid game of blind man, he would ride on Cousin Neville's back up into the woods and look for the Holy Grail. This had been done until the horse had explained that there were limits to everything, even to an unconditional promise, and that if the Holy Grail were not found by the time they reached the seat by the monument, it must remain lost. Yet, as they sat there, at last, Jim with an arm over his late horse's shoulders, Neville really was not quite sure that he had not found it after all, or, at least, that he was not basking in its rose-red light. The relief was amazing. His headache was gone, but that was nothing. Rather, there had lifted from him a horror whose weight he had not dared to appraise so long as it was on him. There had not come back to him even one floating shred or film of that fine-spun black veil that had dimmed the glory of the stream and the morning. And with that relief, physical joy had come back at a rush. He was sure now that the trouble could not be organic. The very seat on which he sat seemed transfigured. He was looking out, panting a little, for the quest had been breathlessly rapid. At the same view, the timbered foreground, the beech trunks, the pine tops, the bracken, the far-off line of the downs at which he had looked with Enid a fortnight ago, all lit with the morning light. Then he had sat there to say goodbye to her. Now, he was sitting here on the morning of the day that was to bring him back to her again. He would see her in a little over 4 hours. "Was the Holy Grail real?" asked Jim. Never recalled his attention. "Real? Oh, I suppose so. No, I should think it wasn't. It was a symbol." "What's a symbol?" "A symbol? Oh, well, it's rather hard to describe. It's a sign of something that really is true, like a fairy story, or at least like some of them." "Oh," said Jim. He seemed a little disappointed. "And what is the thing that's really true?" he pursued presently. Neville jumped. He was thinking about something entirely different. "How do you mean?" "Oh, I see. Well, religion, don't you know? That's what they were after. Did they find it?" Neville perceived it was necessary to attend. Jim's questions were sometimes most disconcertingly to the point. "Did they find it?" He reflected a moment, and as he reflected, he heard 3 strokes from a bell come up from the direction of the house. That would be the elevation. He stole a glance at Jim, who apparently had not heard it. And, at that instant, Neville perceived that he really had arrived at a certain quite definite crossroad. On the one side, there was that for which the bell had spoken just now. On the other side, here was the murmur of the woods, like the murmur of the woods above Frascati. And he saw that these were 2 things, and not one. At least he could not conceive how they could be one. There seemed nothing to unite them, however deep one penetrated. On the one side, there was the little Catholic church where Anna, no doubt, was kneeling at this very moment, with its crucifix over the altar, its stations round the walls, and intellectualized and systemized abstraction from one side of life certainly, but not that side in which he himself really lived and breathed. On the other, here were these woods and these myriad flies dancing in the sunlight, this hum of life, these scents, inexpressibly sweet, of woodland and pine, and a purified breeze from the sea. The 2 things were 2 things, not one, and the girl who had transfigured life to him was on this side, not that. Why, he sat now in the very sanctuary which she had consecrated by her presence. Did they find it? Jim, you've asked me a hard question. What do you mean exactly? Lancelot found it, didn't he? And Sir Galahad? Jim sniffed. Yes, they found the Holy Grail, and the fairy story. But did they find the thing that it meant? You told me that it was not real, but that something else was. Jim was speaking a little drowsily. His head was leaning against Neville. Neville glanced down at him. Look round you, Jim. Don't you think we found it ourselves after all? Jim raised sleepy eyes obediently and looked round. I don't know what you mean, he said. Well, these woods, and the morning, and feeling so happy, and the whole thing. What do you think makes you feel so happy? God, said Jim, as if that settled it. Neville felt a touch of impatience. Yes, of course, he said. This is all God in a sort of way, isn't it? Well then, don't you think we've found the Holy Grail up here, after all? And if we found it, then perhaps— Jim's head nodded suddenly, and Neville remembered that lecturing before breakfast is apt to have that effect, even on grown-up people.